I'm Jim Check. You're watching Kelowna Now. We're just going to close that up. I'm here with Gavin Dew, MLA for Kelowna-Mission, BC Conservative.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and you sent out a press release talking about the small business BC. How does that go?
Well, I mean,
Belly up.
Jim, this is such a wild story, and I mean, I can walk you and viewers through this story. So this started really small. There was this moment, whatever it was, 10 days back, where this little news item broke on social media that Small Business BC had gone bankrupt, and a number of people sent it to me, and they all went,
What's going on?
What's going on? How does Small Business BC go bankrupt? Isn't that like an arm of government? Like, how is this bankrupt? And so I took a screenshot of that and I put it on X, and I just threw it out as a sign of the times. Small Business BC has gone bankrupt at a time when small business in our province, all across Canada, are struggling. We've got obviously the weight of taxes. We've got a soft economy. We've got inflation. We've got tariffs. We've got Canada Post. We've got all these things, and it just felt symbolic that Small Business BC had gone bankrupt. So I threw it out sort of as a passing comment. But once I did that, my DMs and text messages started blowing up, and I started realizing that there was more to the story. And what appeared to have happened is that, let's take it back a step. What is Small Business BC? Small Business BC is a nonprofit that was set up in 1986 after Expo. And it went through a couple of iterations.
So it's been around for a while.
Yeah, 38 years, right? So 38 years of history. This was set up to help support, the development of small businesses in BC, hence the name. And it's funded almost exclusively by the federal and provincial governments, who for the entirety of its existence have had a very strong role in overseeing and governing and directing it. They've had seats on the board of this nonprofit, which it's not a regular arm's length nonprofit. It's basically an entity that was set up to allow the provincial and federal governments to invest in supporting small business in BC, and it did just that. Tens of thousands of businesses have gone through various programming that this organization has provided. And yet, all of a sudden, it was bankrupt. And I started asking, what happened here? Is there more to this story? And just information started flowing in.
And what is some of that information? Like, was there warning signs? Because it just seemed to come out of the blue.
I think for the general public, it came from out of the blue. And as I've later learned in talking to people that have worked with Small Business BC or had a level of knowledge, it seemed as if even the employees and contractors of Small Business BC were sort of blindsided by the situation out of the blue, where again, what had been a very robust organization with a high level of government funding and involvement was suddenly bankrupt. And what I found strange and suspicious is that when I started drawing attention to this issue, you had two levels of government, both provincial and federal, that all of a sudden were acting as if they had never been there. It was like that meme of Homer Simpson backing into the bush, where they were going, well, hold on a second, we don't even know these people. We've got nothing to do with this. And so I started pushing. I started asking questions. I started putting this out there on social media. The premier started getting asked about it in news conferences. The minister responsible for jobs, economic development, and innovation, which has generally provided that oversight for the province, started getting asked by media. And I found their responses to be very weird, because normally what you would expect is if an organization responsible for supporting small business was suddenly in trouble, you would think that you would get in there, stabilize the organization. Maybe you'd had some, what appears to have been the case based on media reporting is maybe you'd had some management issues, maybe you'd had some financial issues. You would think that you'd get in there and figure out, we've got this 38-year-old organization that has tens of thousands of businesses that have been helped, that has a funnel of businesses being referred into it at a time when business is struggling. Wouldn't you think you would get in there and stabilize that organization? Maybe you'd make a management change, bring in a turnaround CEO, get some interim funding in place, put some guardrails around it, and figure out how do we maintain this thing. But instead, two levels of government seem to just sort of back away and want to pretend that they had no involvement in an organization that over the last number of years they had pumped millions of extra dollars
So
into.
they cut the funding? Is that the deal? Or?
So it's not totally clear what happened. We've got no transparency and no answers from government, to the point where they're stonewalling so much that I've actually asked the Auditor General to step in and to do an investigation, because it's apparent that something happened. And they're not saying what happened, but everybody seems to know that something happened. And I would submit that whatever it was, you've got an organization that was overseen by two levels of government, each of whom have had board representation on that organization for 38 years, who ought to have seen whatever happened coming, and who, even as whatever happened was happening, were pumping millions of dollars into and through this organization and are now pretending they were never there. So to me, that says something happened here, and the public needs to have answers as to what happened, who knew, when did they know, and what, if anything, did they do about it.
Public funds in there, obviously there should be public accountability.
There's got to be accountability, and when you see the kind of approach that both levels of government seem to be taking, it seems to be that they're trying to get distance. It seems to be that no effort was made to stabilize and fix and clean up this organization. They all just wanted to get distance from the blast radius of something that is going to come out. But we don't know what that something is. The minister is refusing to answer it. The premier is refusing to answer it. We're getting stonewalled as to what may have happened, and that makes me deeply suspicious.
So is it operating right now?
No. So here's the tragic thing. Again, this is an organization with 38 years of history, which by all accounts, at the fundamental program level, was operating pretty well. It was the funding conduit for the Export Navigator service, which was helping businesses to grow their exports. It was providing a ton of advisory services to small business. It was doing a lot of market analysis. At a fundamental operational level, it appeared to be working. But something seems to have gone wrong, which has been characterized as financial mismanagement at some macro level. But again, if you were a responsible government that had an interest in supporting small business, and you saw an organization that existed to support small business, that you'd pumped millions of dollars into, that you had board oversight on, would you not, as a normal, sane, common sense government, get in there and figure out, how do we fix this thing to make sure that we don't rip another safety net and another support out from under a small business community that is struggling in this province under the weight of all the challenges I talked about before, and in the context where over 7 years of NDP government, we have had 0% private sector job growth. So what happened? Something happened in there, and two levels of government are trying their best to get distance from whatever happened, because I would submit they had a responsibility to oversee this organization, and it appears as though whatever oversight they had, whatever measurement they were doing, whatever accountability was in place through their board members on this purpose-specific organization that they funded heavily, whatever they were supposed to do, something went wrong, and that's what I've asked the Auditor General to get to the bottom of.
Yeah, and I guess we'll have to wait for those answers, right?
Yeah, and as I continue to do so, I keep getting more information. I've learned since I first started talking about this that staff and contractors who were working under this organization basically found out that it had gone completely bankrupt and were dismissed. Their expenses weren't paid. Their salaries weren't paid. We're not talking there was no severance. We're talking there was no payment of invoices from contractors who've been working with this organization for years. So as right up before Christmas, we've had 36 employees and other contractors just scattered to the wind.
So they've even left bills behind.
That's right. They've left bills behind. And more importantly, when you think about...
So that is kind of like mismanagement, because it's
Absolutely.
Like, you don't even think they would have blown the whistle a little bit earlier and said, hey, we're in trouble here.
So what I'm gathering...
Or they thought funding was coming.
What I'm gathering is they did. And that's what really gets under my skin is, by all evidence, this organization went to government. The board of the organization seems to have gone to government. And again, government had representation on the board and said, this has gone sideways. Government had to know that had happened. And this appeared to have happened during or immediately on the other side of the provincial election.
Yeah.
So, in order to avoid the political blowback of whatever happened there, it seems as though the provincial government was ready, willing, and able to bury this organization 6 feet deep, cast all of its people to the wind, destroy all of its programming, lose all of its institutional memory in order to get clear of whatever issue or scandal may well emerge. And the tragic thing is, once you've let go of all of these people, once you've lost that institutional continuity, well, the reality is those folks are all going to move on. They're all going to get hired somewhere else. Your funnel of people being referred into this organization are now going to be scattered. You have, and this can be confirmed, you have companies that were receiving assistance from employees and contractors of Small Business BC to try to grow their businesses, grow their exports, who literally all of a sudden had no support one day. So they're totally,
it's like showing up at work and they got a sign on the door that says,
yeah. But all of that is the case because the government refused to solve the problem. Instead of trying to solve the problem, they appear to have tried to hide the problem and to get distance from some micro scandal. And in so doing, they have destroyed continuity. They have scattered this organization to the winds. They have lost all its capacity. They have lost all of its people. And they don't appear to have any plan whatsoever as to how to replace this organization. So even if they go and try to replace it, it's going to take months to get people back up and running. You're going to lose all that continuity. There's going to be a loss of continuity for businesses that were relying on these programs just as we're struggling. So, for example, we have this threat of new tariffs coming from Trump. We have an export navigator program run under Small Business BC that is exactly the kind of advice that BC-based companies needed in order to diversify their exports or to understand how to navigate the potential impact of tariffs. So just as we have this major significant existential threat to small businesses in BC, this government allowed a crucial support service to collapse because they couldn't be bothered to fix it. They just wanted to get distance from it to avoid a political scandal.
Perhaps they were focused on the deficit that they just recorded here, and it's a record for a new record high in provincial
Not a
history.
good record, though, Jim.
Yeah, no,
not the kind of record you want to have.
$9.4 billion.
Yeah.
Brenda Bailey announced that. So that in itself, because the difference between a provincial government and a federal government, the feds obviously can print some money,
yeah,
but the province has no ability to print money. And this is more due to falling revenues than it has to do with the spending.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, obviously they have grown spending massively over the last number of years. This is a government that has just poured kerosene on the fire of deficit spending and has just spent wild amounts of money. But what's also happening, which is really worrisome, is a collapse of revenue. So, Brenda Bailey, who you mentioned, was the Minister of Jobs, Economic Development and Innovation, who, by the way, had oversight over this whole situation with Small Business BC. Who also presided over a period in time when there was zero private sector job creation in this province. So the Minister of No Jobs has been promoted by David Eby to the Minister of No Money. Yeah. We now have a situation where we are facing a growing deficit in part because business tax revenues have collapsed. Why have they collapsed? Maybe it has something to do with the fact that, again, we've had 0% private sector job growth under this NDP government. People are deeply concerned about investment conditions in British Columbia. I have good friends who are leaving this province because they can no longer see themselves building a business here. It is virtually impossible to do anything on the land base in this province because of uncertainty and instability that's being made worse by this NDP government. And a lot of, half of the 18 to 34-year-olds in this province are considering leaving and going to somewhere where they feel they can be successful. And that has happened on David Eby's watch. That has happened under this NDP government. They have cratered our economy. They have left us in a perilous situation. And now, as we saw yesterday, the fiscal situation of this province continues to worsen. Meanwhile, in their release, they've got their Minister of Finance saying that they will maybe eventually someday, one day, make a plan to start moving out of deficits. This is just an irresponsible government.
A lot of our GDP in British Columbia obviously comes from our resource sector, and that's from mining, forestry, and energy. we did a ton of stories and during the election on forestry, and then it's John Russett said it was in shambles. Kevin Falcon said that it was tragic. I think maybe that was backwards, and I think maybe John said that it was tragic. But it was clear even when I interviewed the forest minister and David Eby, they recognized that forestry is not in good stead. Canfor came out and said they're pulling their money. They were going to do a big investment in Houston. They pulled that. They said they just can't operate in BC. And then they cut shifts in Prince George and they closed their mill in Bear Lake. And that, they're not the only ones. AP planers, all that kind of stuff. So forestry is definitely on life support in British Columbia. And right next door, when they said, "Oh, you got to look in Alabama," and stuff like, well, you don't look next door. Forestry's doing well. Forestry's doing well in Alberta. So it's not. What I got from them was conservation. From Stephen Jabot was kind of like directing some of the stuff here that's really hindering our because you can't get access to cut blocks and stuff like that, access to fiber.
Yeah, I mean, look, you can't get access to fiber. You've got all kinds of challenges. I would say, this government has brought forestry to its knees, and now their proposed solution is another study because they've cut a deal with the Greens. So, they want to do another study. They've done, 3, 4 major studies in the last number of years. At some point, you have to stop studying, start implementing, and get to a point where you realize that a massive, massive part of our economy is forestry in this province, is the resource sector.
And the biggest threat that we have to British Columbia is wildfires, which is poor forest management that contributes to those wildfires.
Yeah, and I say this often, wildfires are obviously a crucial issue in terms of community safety, but they're also a really important environmental issue. Yeah. Last year in 2023, Canada produced 23% of global wildfire emissions. Wildfire emissions in this country produce 2 or 3 times the entirety of human and industrial emissions. So we should be taking a much more proactive approach around addressing wildfires. We spend 9 times as much fighting them as we do preventing them. There's a huge opportunity there environmentally as well.
I know that both Rustad and Falcon had a plan for forestry. It just seems like it's such an important issue, and they should be inviting the forestry companies, the logging companies, Canfors and the Tolcos and the AP planners and that to the table to see if they can find a better solution for this, right? Because there is other countries in the world that do extremely well, like Finland and that, and because they have young forests. Old forests mean more fires, right?
Yeah. Yeah. There are plenty of places in the world where forestry continues to be a going concern, continues to succeed, and where they're not continually self-sabotaging. We can certainly learn from other jurisdictions and by talking to industry, as we've been doing. But I mean, the reality and the contrast could not be stronger. In this NDP government, we have a weak, inexperienced cabinet. We have a forest minister who, as far as I know, has never held a job in the private sector, much less cut down a tree or planted one. Meanwhile, on our side of the aisle, we have a forest critic in Ward Stamer, who's worked for 40 years in forestry and run a large forestry company. So, the contrast is massive, and that is the case across, frankly, most of the portfolios in cabinet, which is probably why David Eby is terribly afraid to actually call the legislature and to get down to the business of governing this province and to be held accountable in question period. He is deferring that until February 18th of next year.
Bruce Rose said that one of the bigger problems is that most people in the Lower Mainland go to Stanley Park and they see those big trees and they think all forests in BC are like that and they don't cut any of those trees down. It's a completely different story out here in these forests, right? Like these are like different types of trees, and they're meant to be, they're either going to burn or something. They don't last as long, and they need to be harvested and cleared so that they don't create a hazard for the communities, because wildfire is definitely a big concern for the Okanagan.
Yeah, and I think you've also touched on a fundamental disconnect, which is that we really need to improve the level of resource literacy in the Lower Mainland. Like I'm the son of a mining engineer. I grew up in Vancouver. Vancouver, the Lower Mainland, down to the coast, they benefit massively from the resource sector, and we have a huge opportunity around innovation in the resource sector, around resource innovation. One of the cultural disconnects that I think is a real problem is that in British Columbia, we have I'm being simplistic, but we have a tendency to talk as if tech jobs are going to replace resource jobs. Yeah. And that, firstly, that's not true. Secondly, the reality is a vast amount of technology and innovation is being brought to bear in the resource sector. So if you look, to our neighbors to the east in Alberta, the approach they've taken around innovation and investment, which is working very well, is the realization that you need to have investments in innovation all across different fundamental sectors in the economy. And they are thriving in terms of investments in agricultural technology, in oil and gas, in forestry, in all those areas. We believe, when I talk to my fellow economic critics in the Conservative caucus, we're very big believers in resource innovation. We're very big believers in the importance of talking about how we bring those pieces together and how we break down that cultural and geographic divide and start realizing and reinforcing the idea that all of British Columbia has the opportunity to benefit from resource innovation, which will allow us to do responsible, sustainable resource development, and we can export that leadership and export those resources to the world and make a bunch of money while we're doing it, which is what we need in order to pay for all the social services we all want, and which is exactly what the NDP hasn't been doing, which is why they've got, historical deficits.
I think one of the things that most people don't realize, like the towns outside the Lower Mainland weren't created because they think that's a great place for a town. Dawson Creek isn't there because it's a great spot. It's there because of oil and gas. It's there because of forestry. Prince George is there because of the resource sector.
Vancouver's there because of the railway.
Right, but I'm just saying, like most of the communities outside of the Lower Mainland right now exist because of the resource sector.
You know why Coal Harbor's called Coal Harbor?
Coal.
Shocking.
But you know what I mean? Like it's. I think a lot of people don't understand. Like a lot of the money for British Columbia comes out of the resource sector.
Yeah, and on a per capita basis, the economic contribution of rural British Columbia is absolutely massive. So, we're not going to succeed either economically or from a political and community perspective as a province if we continue to be divided between resource and non-resource, or if we continue to have this artificial divide between the idea that there is an old sunset resource industry and a new tech industry. That's just not true. A huge amount of tech is being brought to bear, a huge amount of resource innovation is being brought to bear, and a huge amount of capital is being invested from the resource sector into innovation. And we have a massive opportunity as a province if we get that balance right and change that narrative. And what I would add is I think that Kelowna actually is uniquely positioned to do that because we are in some ways geographically and culturally positioned between Alberta and BC. So I think there's a really big opportunity there that I want to continue exploring.
One of the other things that bothered me about the deficit was that here we have this deficit which didn't just creep up on them. They would have known it was coming. Yet at the same time, they reached into our pockets and gave themselves all a raise by giving everybody a cabinet position. So that's another way of giving themselves all a raise, as opposed because you guys didn't get the raise. So it was just a way to give a raise to all the NDP MLAs, but without the Greens or the Conservatives.
I'm not concerned about whether we get a raise or not. Yeah. What I'm concerned about is people of British Columbia. So what you have is a government that got elected and that really got together for just long enough to give themselves a raise that will cost $1.9 million a year to the taxpayers of British Columbia. Meanwhile, it will end up having been 5 months from the election before the legislature actually sits and before this government is held to account by the opposition. So they are dodging accountability. They are paying themselves more. They have a massive deficit that was finally disclosed in a significantly delayed fiscal statement. As Peter Millibar, who's our finance critic, put it, if this fiscal statement had been released during the election, I highly doubt that the NDP would still be in government.
How though, like, do you reconcile? You run a business, and also, as a family, you run, your own finances. Like, you can't go out and dole out raises to your business, the people that work for you, or that if you have no money.
Yeah, it's funny actually because both the Premier and the Minister of Finance have been using this metaphor they obviously think is cute, which is that you can't pour from an empty cup. So they're starting to talk about the realization that it turns out you actually need an economy to pay for things, but the reality is they've poured the cup out because they were using it to do shots. Right? They've been wholly irresponsible with fiscal management, number one. Number two, they've done absolutely nothing to actually support private sector job growth and economic growth in this province. And yet now they're acting as if they're suddenly responsible. They're acting as if they're going to take action on this. The reality is you've got a pyromaniac who has set fire fiscally to this province, who's now showing up with a squirt gun, spraying a bit of water on the ashes and looking for applause. That's what David Eby's doing. It is wildly absurd. The fact that they think they have any credibility on fiscal management and any credibility on trying to grow the economy is completely wild, completely out of touch. And I have not heard from anyone who believes any of this.
Yeah, it just seems to me like it's pretty, as an accountant, that it's seems irresponsible to be giving everybody, because it's unprecedented to give everybody like a cabinet position too, right? Like that seemed odd, no?
Yeah, I mean, every single member of the NDP caucus now either has a cabinet role, a parliamentary secretary role, or
Yeah,
a
like a
speaker.
raise
So,
basically.
yeah, everyone gets a raise.
Yeah,
And again, they're not showing up to work, right?
no,
We're talking 5 months
yeah.
between the election and the first sitting after they committed to having a fall session. And by the way, there are concrete things they could be dealing with immediately if they actually got down to work. They could be addressing locally here. They could be fixing the short-term rental rules, which have helped to kill tourism in Kelowna. They could be, they promised everyone to basically bribe them with their own money for, $1,000. They're not doing it. That's not going to happen until March. There's all kinds of substantive action they could be taking right now to address, the tariff threat, to address all kinds of key things, and yet they will not meet. And I think it's because David Eby is frankly terrified of what's going to happen if we actually get into question period, because our critics are going to run circles around one of the most inexperienced cabinets in the history of British Columbia, who are standing on the back of a shameful record of fiscal mismanagement and economic destruction. And I think when we're able to hold this government to account, uh, folks are going to see just how mismatched a situation that is. They're going to see in the Conservative Party of British Columbia a government in waiting that is focused on the right things. And I think it's going to take a whole lot less than 4 years for us to get a change in government.
Are they fortunate right now that they're hiding under the cover of the big news story of the federal government kind of thing? Like that is the story that's kind of dominating most of the media outlets.
I think they absolutely are. I think it's no surprise and it's no accident that they finally released their delayed fiscal statement just as all of this news was breaking out of Ottawa around Justin Trudeau and the federal Liberals. I think that David Eby is certainly hoping to hide underneath that controversy and to buy time to try to figure out what the heck their plan is going to be and what the heck their narrative is going to be.
And a really big contrast from what Danielle Smith is doing versus what David Eby's doing. Danielle Smith is actually going down to the United States and trying to make deals and trying to like work with the people down there. And David Eby is just saying we're going to be tough, right? Like I mean, I think Trump as anything is like he's probably one of the biggest bullies when it comes to negotiating. That's art of the deal. That's his thing. That's his shtick. But just saying you're going to be tough with him is probably like not really the best way to deal with it. What they want from us is our resources, and what we seem to want to do, especially in British Columbia, is suppress our resources.
Yeah, I just don't think that the David Eby's going to have any credibility in that negotiation. I think with all the drama that's happening in Ottawa, I think that we'd be a lot better off in British Columbia if David Eby joined hand in hand with his friend Justin Trudeau and went on that proverbial walk in the snow and decided that it was time to move on and time to give way to new leadership in his party, because he frankly has led his party to the brink of electoral defeat after being handed the leadership without a contest. He was, an unelected premier who barely managed to stay elected. I think his position in his party is severely weakened, and I do not expect that he will last the full 4 years because there's very clearly already dissent in the NDP ranks.
No surprise that they did the deal with the Greens. I mean, that seemed to be like that was a foregone collusion, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
I mean, it just seemed like he knew that was going to happen, even though the Greens kept saying, "Well, there's no deal made," but I mean, it just like he knew it was going to happen.
I think in that regard, it's just a matter of watching the clock to see what happens first, right? Is David Eby going to stab the Greens in the back, or is Sonia Furstenau going to show up as either a federal NDP candidate or a well-paid government appointee?
It seems like more of the same, though. Do you know what I mean? Like it just we're back to where Andrew Weaver was running the ship, and then I'm going to get to the carbon tax because he did say that he would axe the tax if Pierre Poilievre ran government. That'll remain to be seen now because Sonia doesn't seem to want to get rid of the tax. So now they also have to play no different than the Liberals have to play ball with Jagmeet Singh all the time. Um, it seems to me like one of the things that is out there. Energy is a basic human need, I think. You know what I mean? Because you need it to heat your home, you need it to everything we do, we eat, everything is derived from energy. And it seems like we're taxing a basic human need while taxing it like it was a luxury item.
Mm.
And then we have and federally we have people, and even you could say provincially, people living high off of the tax dollars lavishly in real luxury, while the common person is being taxed for basic human needs.
Yeah, and I think that's why you've seen such a political evolution in Canada. I mean, a lot of people that traditionally might have seen themselves being represented by the NDP, federally or provincially, have made the switch to the Conservatives because I think that hardworking families feel as if they're being left behind. They feel as if their basic ability to succeed and to support their families is being continually undermined by not only this provincial government, but also by a federal NDP that has completely abandoned working families and is completely enthralled with woke culture war stuff at the expense of working Canadians.
I should correct something. When I did interview Sonia First Snow, she wants to remove the carbon tax at the pump, which is what's punishing people, and put it at the wellhead. So is that something that she's definitely has control, really? Because at any point she can say this government's over. So I guess the question would be to David Eby, and Sonia First now, will you remove the tax at the pump, which is really crushing people?
Well, I think the question actually is to the two Green MLAs, and that is, will they continue to be led by an unelected leader who has
That's
no
weird too,
seat in the
though.
legislature? Like at some point, they are going to have to figure out how to stand on their own 2 feet and how to lead their own party. It's a quirky dynamic, and the Greens are a quirky party, but they are going to have to figure out what flavor of green they are, and they are going to have to figure out how to lead themselves and how to develop a coherent agenda.
It's kind of like unprecedented times in ways. I don't know. I'm sure if that's ever happened before, but the leader of the party not holding a seat, and then federally, like there was talk that Mark Carney would come in as finance minister again, not an elected official, to hold one of the biggest positions in Canada.
That would have been a wildly stupid thing for Mark Carney to do, and it would have ended his political career immediately.
Yeah, I'm just saying, but there's a lot of talk about that, right? So
I didn't do it, right? I mean,
so far,
yeah, so far.
we don't know what surprise shows up tomorrow.
Yeah,
right?
and it is just I generally don't get into federal politics too much, but it's absolutely wild to watch what's happening and to think about what the implications are going to be from a provincial perspective.
The sad thing is politics don't really play a role in a lot of people's daily lives, but they have lately, though, because it's so bad. And people are suffering, so politics are becoming a bigger role, and it's talk around the dinner table. It's talk everywhere. It's talk, like you can't really talk to anybody without talking politics. I mean, people are upset.
They are, like, people are frustrated. They're feeling it. They're hurting. I mean, the basic everyday financial survival of Canadian and British Columbia families is at risk. So people are, when they're feeling that personal strain, two things happen. Number one is they engage politically in a way they never have before. And number two is that they want to see a focus on fundamentals, not on luxury beliefs. And what we have
dinner table stuff.
Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah. Pocketbook stuff. What we see right now, both at a federal and provincial level, is we have governments that have been chasing off in these wild ideological directions where they're focused on luxury beliefs. They're focused on telling people what to do, but people's day-to-day standards of living are falling apart. Per capita GDP is down. Per capita debt is way up. People feel as if they've got multiple levels of government that just aren't interested in their basic everyday economic survival. And that is where we as an opposition, are going to have a significant focus, which is, driving a never-ending drumbeat around economic growth and private sector jobs to make sure that not only do people have opportunity in this province, but also we have a strong economy that can pay for the social services, the education and healthcare, and all those other things that we need from government.
I'll end with this: the Canadian dollar it looks like it wants to collapse. I'm not saying completely collapse, but into the low 60s, which would be really harmful to lots of Canadians because we import a lot of our food goods. Great for exporters, but horrible for people that are trying to, buy their day-to-day living items. Um, and we should have a strong dollar based on our resource sector, but again, the suppression of our resources seems to be what is driving that dollar lower.
Yeah, I mean, look, when it comes to our resource sector, I think that we have to. Something I've been saying recently a lot is that policy is downstream from politics, and politics is downstream from culture. And we have developed a culture in British Columbia and in Canada more broadly, where we are ashamed of our resource sector. We are ashamed of our resource endowment instead of being proud of the fact that we have this amazing endowment of riches that has the potential to make Canada one of the greatest and most economically strong countries on earth. What we should be doing is focusing on resource innovation, focusing on responsible resource development, focusing on exporting our resources and exporting our leadership, and on being proud of what we're doing. And I think that's the kind of cultural shift that we need to undergo in British Columbia, to returning to a can-do attitude, returning to an ambitious attitude, returning to a celebration of achievement and a belief in the possibility of prosperity. I don't see that happening under this NDP government. And I do believe that what we can do as a Conservative opposition is start driving that cultural conversation and start acting as a government in waiting that is focused on all of the right things. And then if we do that, I believe that the next election will be an economic election, and I believe that we will win an overwhelming victory and form a new and better government for the people of British Columbia.
I think Canadians have to come to terms with that. We are a resource-based economy. If you look at the TSX, which is the bulk of our GDP, it's mostly resource companies. If you look at the towns that we just talked about,
Yep.
they're created out of resource companies. If you go into any hospital and you look at the big equipment, donated by Kinross, donated by all these other mining companies, forestry companies, and all that stuff. And most of the high-paying jobs in Canada are resource-based. And I think Canadians need to come to terms with that, because what you just talked about, the tech sector right now, there's a giant sucking sound, and a lot of that capital is going to flow south of the border because they're incentivizing people with taxation, less regulation, and why wouldn't you? And then the capital gains tax here. Like, why would you start a tech company when you can start it anywhere? Resource companies, you can't start anywhere because the resource company is where the resource is, right? So that's what Canada has.
Yeah.
That's the anchor, right? Like, you can't move Fort Mac to Alabama, but you sure move Spotify or Shopify to
Well, and
Silicon
that,
Valley.
that that really is the concern, right? I talked to a lot of small businesses that could be anywhere. I was talking to a senior executive from a great Canadian success story yesterday, who, in all likelihood, will move to the United States by this time next year.
There's a giant sucking sound happening right now,
Yep.
and it's capital leaving. But our strength is our resource sector, and you can't move the resources. You can't pick up our oil and gas or LNG and move it somewhere. It's
Well,
there.
but this is the issue, Jim, right? What we have is a scenario where any investment or industry that is tethered to the land base
Yeah.
is virtually impossible to get moving. So it isn't happening. And at the same time, any individual who is enterprising and who has the capacity to create a company, well, they can do it anywhere. And the signal we're sending is don't do it here in BC.
Yeah.
So that's the challenge. We've got to change that culture. We've got to be proud of our history and excited about our future. And we've got to signal to people that we want them to be successful here. And some of that is policy, some of that is politics, some of that is culture. But we have to turn that corner, and that is what's crucially important.
The biggest investment that I've heard in a long time for Canada is Kevin O'Leary talking about a $70 billion investment in northern Alberta for a couple of reasons. An AI center for the LNG access to cheap energy, to the colder weather for those computers, right, that generate a lot of heat. So
there's no reason why we couldn't be pursuing and enabling projects like that in British Columbia. We just appear to have a government that lacks ambition and lacks a basic understanding of how investments happen.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add today?
I feel like that was a bit of a bum note. So let's be optimistic. Look, I think that we do have better days ahead for British Columbia. I think that obviously our job as an opposition, the Conservative opposition, is to hold the government to account, and we will do that every single day. But I think it's also really important for us as a government in waiting, as shadow ministers, not just critics, to articulate a really positive vision of what is possible under new leadership and under a new culture for British Columbia. So, my hope and my New Year's resolution for 2025 is to make sure that we're spending as much time laying out that positive vision as we are punching holes in a government that's really easy to punch holes in. So,
and I think that's what's been missing, is a strong opposition in British Columbia for sure. Like we need a strong media too. We need a strong media that goes after and holds government accountable, holds power accountable, and that's what the opposition should do as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Jim. So, on that note, that's what I look forward to doing in 2025. Obviously, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year's, Happy Holidays, whatever you celebrate it proudly to everyone who's watching. And thanks so much for having me.
Hey, thank you for coming in as usual. And we'll see you many more times, I'm sure.
You bet.
And again, from Kelowna Now, Merry Christmas as well, and season's greetings, and we'll have lots more live streams. We had lots going on today. We had Renee Merrifield in with Beyond the Bell. Lots we talked about there today. We had the mayor in yesterday for an update from the city. So make sure you subscribe to Kelowna Now. We're streaming right now. We're streaming not just on X. We're also streaming on TikTok now, LinkedIn. And this goes on, the story will get done and it'll be on our YouTube as well. So many different ways for you to consume the content that we're creating here on Kelowna Now. And we thank you for watching Kelowna Now.
We don't just report the news, we live here too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us. No government funding, no outside influence. Kelowna Now, local, independent. News you can trust.